Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to week 7 of the NPTEL MOOCs course on development research methods. So far in this course we have moved quite far, and we've mostly covered the theoretical issues concerning development research methods. We have in the earlier weeks been introduced to the issues surrounding the paradigms of development research methods, issues on ethics concerning development research methods. We've also looked at why we say there should be rigor in development studies and what are the constituents of rigor in development studies research. We then moved into qualitative research methods, quantitative research methods and mixed methods research methods. Now in this week and in the concluding week, the next week, which is the concluding week of this course on development research methods, we will look at some of the selected approaches to development issues and the operationalization issues concerning the adoption of these selected approaches in development research methods. Starting this week, we will look at the rights-based approach to development and the operationalization issues concerning the adoption of rights-based approach to development in development research. In the second lesson of this week, we will look at poverty, certain poverty indicators, poverty measurements and poverty analysis, and the concerns surrounding the application of poverty measures and analysis in development research. And in the third lesson of this week, we will look up some gender sensitive indicators and gender analysis and the concerns surrounding operationalization of the gender sensitive indicators. In the next week, which is the concluding week of this course, we will look at some certain social capital assessment tools, monitoring and evaluation frameworks, which have today become integral to the development research methods and development research frameworks. And finally, we will summarize the course with a brief note on development research methods, along with we will put together the views of the researchers on what are the concerns that should be kept in mind on development research methods, the practical issues concerning development research. So in today's lesson, we will mostly look at operationalizing rights-based approach to development. What we will cover in today's lesson is as follows. We'll first look at the principles and concepts surrounding rights-based approach to development. Most of you, since if you're coming from the field of development studies or issues concerning development cutting across different disciplines, you would know that the human rights approach or the rights-based approaches to development have in a way become central to following development research. And so in this lesson, what I'll do is give you a very brief introduction to rights-based approaches to development, but then we will quickly look at some of the operational issues concerning rights-based approach to development and how different organizations have come up with tools and measures of ensuring that rights-based approach to development has been implemented in the project goals that we are pursuing. So that's the second part of this lesson, where we will look at the operationalization aspect of rights-based approaches, and then finally we'll end today's lesson with the challenges of implementing rights-based approach to development. Now let us look at some of the perspectives surrounding rights-based approach to development. Now a rights-based approach to development is basically a conceptual framework for the process of human development that is normatively based on international human rights standards and operationally directed to promoting and protecting human rights. So essentially a rights-based approach integrates the norms, standards and principles of international human rights system into the plans, policies and processes of development. So, we can say that it describes situations not simply in terms of human needs or of development requirements, but in terms of society's obligations to respond to the inalienable rights of individuals, and empowers people to demand justice as a right and not a charity, and gives communities a moral basis from which to claim international assistance when needed. Now, let us look at more into some of the perspectives on a rights based approach. So, rights based approach would also mean that one has the courage to build local, national and global movements that argue for specific duties to be met by governments, corporations and individuals that will enable all people to enjoy their rights. And above all, it involves abolishing the development enterprise as a neo-colonial program of correction administered from rich to poor, and replacing it with a common political project that requires everyone's equal rights and judges the behavior of all on the basis of how they realize or violate these rights. Now, it is at this point, let me introduce my audience to some of the examples with regard to how rights based approaches to development have been integrated into the development paradigm. Many of you must have heard about the Right to Food Act, the Right to Employment Act and the Right to Education Act, and some of these acts are examples of how central rights based approach to development has become a part of the policy exercise, particularly in the post 90s period, the period in which the United Nations framework has brought in the concept of human development and human rights perspectives and approaches to development. In the Indian context, for example, we have right to education, right to food and right to employment in place. Currently, we are also talking about right to health frameworks. So, these are certain examples of how policy frameworks have been designed surrounding the concept of rights based approach to development. Now, if we'll, how do we integrate human rights agenda to the development paradigm? Socioeconomic development is regarded as part of the human rights agenda dating back to the time the Universal Declaration of Human Rights articulated economic, social, cultural, civil and political human rights in a single document, and this dates back to 1948. So, this has been an integral part of, so human rights has been thought and it cannot be unthought. So, in a sense, so it dates back to a very long period of time in history. Although there are ideological divisions between the Western liberal democracies and the East Bloc, and the rise of an international civil society in the post Cold War period brought human rights to the forefront. And a host of world summits held from 1990s onwards, as I was pointing out, the UN summits particularly, as it's and these summits have highlighted the discourse on relationship between human rights and international development cooperation. Now, during the late 1990s, with the launching of UN reforms, the Secretary General called for mainstreaming of human rights in all of the UN's development work. Some of you, if you can go through the UN development reports or the human development reports, you would see that the rights based approach to development or human rights framework have been cited time and again as one of the markers of human development, and also not just markers of human development, but making these frameworks part and parcel of how development should be pursued in the first place. So, rights based approaches have taken up several organizations, have been taken up by several organizations such as CARE, Save the Children, the UNICEF. There are various bilateral donor agencies that have also been promoting rights perspectives in their assistance. And further impetus in the year 2000 happened with the launching of UNDP's Human Development Report with a focus on human rights and human development. And this Human Development Report made a compelling argument for an integrated approach to development, drawing upon the principles of international human rights and the strategies of human development to advance dignity and well-being. Now, what are the principles and concepts of human rights? Although this lesson is not attributed entirely to understanding the concepts and principles, however, the basic principles and concepts of human rights, looking at some of the basic principles and components of human rights, concepts of human rights will help us understand what are the operationalization issues with regard to this framework. So, some of them are as follows: social and political guarantees. They are necessary to protect individuals from the standard threats to human dignity posed by the modern state and modern markets. Let me here take the example of food security and food sovereignty as different frameworks. Where there are scholars and there are practitioners who have been emphasizing on the need for food security, and there are scholars and practitioners who have been challenging the processes of food security framework and have rather come up with food sovereignty framework. And if you look closely, if you read closely the frameworks that I have just cited, you would see that at the center of all of these frameworks are the issue of social and political guarantees necessary to protect individuals from the standard threats to human dignity posed by the modern state and modern markets. Human rights also take departure in the International Bill of Rights, which comprises the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the consequent International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which came in 1976. Now, some of the other central human rights documents are Convention on the Rights of the Child, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and so on. So, these are some of the important documents that can be had in mind when we are looking at so to say mainstreaming human rights in development approaches or operationalizing human rights approach in development studies or development practice, whatever is the area of interest. Now, let us briefly also look at the concepts of rights holders and duty bearers. So, when we are talking about human rights, whose right is it? Whose human right are we protecting? And who are the actors in this framework that we are looking up to, that has the obligation of ensuring that the rights of the rights holders are met. So, who are the right holders? Rights holders, they are all people belonging to a group. We have human rights simply because we are human beings, and these rights are held equally and inalienably. Now, who are the duty bearers? States are the principal duty bearers. A state is legally obliged to respect, protect and fulfill all human rights for all citizens, and to facilitate, provide or promote rights. And the state also acts as a regulator or facilitator of other actors who provide services such as the market and civil society. Now, there are other actors as well apart from individuals in the state. So, there are moral duty bearers, organizations and institutions of moral obligations. Similarly, actors may exist at the local level such as NGOs or transnational corporations, regional organizations, United Nations, various other international organizations and the like. So, there are various actors within a framework, and they are all inalienably bound to each other if the human rights of the rights holders have to be protected and ensured. Now, let us look at some of the obligations of state parties to international human rights law. The obligation to respect, to abstain from carrying out, sponsoring or tolerating any practice, policy or legal measure violating the integrity of individuals, legislative and administrative codes that take account of guaranteed rights, the obligation to protect, to prevent the violation of rights by other individuals or non-state state actors, access to legal remedies in case of violations occurring. There is also an obligation to fulfill issues of advocacy, which involving issues of advocacy, public expenditure, governmental regulation of the economy, provision of basic services and active measures necessary for guaranteeing opportunities to access entitlements. What are the obligations of other parties? So, there are primary, secondary, tertiary and external duty bearers. Let us look at some of them. Who are the primary duty bearers? Example, parents for children, teachers for students, doctors, nurses for patients, etc. So, within a society, when we are looking at the social organizations, let us say family, there are certain responsibilities or duties of these organizations towards the other actors, for example, parents towards children, teachers towards students and so on. Similarly, secondary duty bearers, example institutions and organizations with immediate jurisdiction over the primary duty bearers. Tertiary duty bearers, example institutions and organizations at a higher level, example NGOs, and external duty bearers, for example countries, institutions, organizations with no direct involvement, example the World Trade Organization, UN organizations, the international NGOs, Security Council, and so on and so forth. So all of these all of these are actors that can go on to ensure human rights as a part of a development paradigm. So this is just to give you a brief overview of what is contained within the human rights approach or the rights based approach that we are talking about. There are duties, there are rights holders, and there are duties and obligations of duty providers. Now let us look at the operationalization issues of human rights, or how do we operationalize the human rights approach. Now there is a growing number of development cooperation organizations that claim to be applying rights based approach, and the majority however are actually applying human rights perspective to development assistance and poverty reduction. So a rights based perspective may however be a first step in the direction of a rights based approach until an organization's capacities and methodologies have been adequately developed to allow for a full scale rights based approach. So let us understand what is human rights perspective here. Now a human rights perspective recognizes that there is an intrinsic link between poverty and human rights at the policy and strategic level. So if we are looking at the state of poverty, the state of lowness of incomes as simply just an economic dimension, or whether we are looking at lowness of incomes as a human right issue, whether we are looking at poverty as a human right issue, as an issue of dignity, of not being able to access the goods of life because of lowness of income, or are we looking at lowness of income only as an economic dimension that needs to be overcome by the state actors, let us say. So this is where there needs to be a right kind of a perspective to understand the development issues that we are pursuing. So human rights perspective basically advocates that one needs to recognize that there is an intrinsic link between poverty and human rights at the policy and strategy level. More than poverty being an economic dimension, it is mostly a human rights issue, and therefore needs to be overcome. It also mainstreams human rights by applying them consistently throughout the development cooperation process, and usually it is not guided by the realization of all human rights for all people as the foremost goal, although it should be, but it is not guided by the realization of this. Now human rights based approach has many elements in common with other approaches used by development practitioners. For example, the emphasis on participation in development work resonates with the right of individuals to take part in the conduct of public affairs and the related rights of association, assembly, and expression. Now let us look at some of the differences between a needs approach and a rights approach. This, as I said, the human rights based approach has many elements in common with other approaches currently used by development practitioners, and there are three basic features that the rights based approach that helps us distinguish rights based approach from other approaches. We will come to some of these differences next, but let us have a look at this illustration of differences between needs approach and rights based approach. Needs approach basically helps us work towards certain outcome goals. So in the example of poverty that we just took, if we are looking at poverty as some kind of a basic needs problem, people not having access to income or not having access to food, then if we are looking at it simply as a needs based problem, then we can frame policies, or we can come up with different kinds of development projects that helps us work towards the outcome of ensuring that people have access to the incomes that they need. However, if we are following a human rights perspective or an approach, one works towards outcome and process goals. one works towards the processes through which one can have access to those incomes. So, it is not just outcome oriented, but it is also process oriented. So, in the sense that whether people have access to minimum wages or not, we are not just concerned about whether people are experiencing increase in incomes or people are experiencing some incomes in their hands, but we are also ensuring whether the legal processes which ensures that people work with dignity, people find employment with dignity, and people have access to the minimum wages for the work that they are doing is also ensured. So, it looks at the processes as well as the outcome goals. Needs approach recognizes needs as valid claims, whereas human rights approach recognizes that rights always imply obligations of the state. So, when someone says that I am poor and I need to have access to incomes, it is said to be a very valid claim, because people need to have access to incomes to be able to access other necessities of life or the comforts of life. However, when we are following, and these comforts of life can be provided by the state, by the market. However, when we are following the human rights approach, we are trying to bring in the perspective that the right of an individual to have access to income has to have some implication, has to have some linkage with what is the obligation of the state. It is the obligation of the state to ensure that employment needs to be provided. It is the obligation of the state to ensure that the required minimum wages or the amount of wages goes to the people that are working towards it. So, needs approach recognizes needs as valid claims, whereas human rights approach recognizes rights always imply obligations of the state. Needs approach does not think empowerment is necessary to meet all needs, whereas human rights approach recognizes that rights can only be realized with empowerment. One needs to be empowered. So, to give you an example, when we are looking at the right to employment, or right to food, for example, in India we have the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. Now, we have had various other employment programs in place before the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program. However, what is different with the Rural Employment Guarantee Program is that this program or this act, which is mandated by the act, entitles people to demand work as a matter of right and not just as a matter of claim. Which means that there is a legal backing to the fact that I require work because I need to survive, and survival is my human right, and therefore employment becomes my human right. And therefore, rights based approach empowers people through some form of entitlements usually to be able to demand the work or demand the kind of needs that they have. So, needs based approach does not make empowerment necessary to meet all needs, whereas human rights approach recognizes that rights can only be realized with empowerment. Needs approach accepts charity as the driving motivation for meeting needs, whereas human rights approach states that charity is insufficient motivation for meeting needs and often makes the issue of charity redundant. Needs approach focuses on manifestations of problems and immediate causes of problems, whereas human rights approach focuses on structural causes of problems as well as manifestations and immediate causes of problems. So, understanding the social organization, the structural issues that has created the problem in the first place is something that the human rights approach considers integral when we are talking about mainstreaming human rights in development approaches. Needs approach focuses on the social context with little emphasis on policy, whereas human rights approach focuses on social, economic, cultural, civil and political context and is definitely policy oriented. So, the policy focus as far as human rights approach is concerned is again very central and integral to the framework with respect to development. Now, let us look at this a small illustration again with regard to rights based analysis. Now, rights based analysis, if you see on the slide, it takes departure in the principles of equality and non-discrimination to identify patterns of poverty, powerlessness, social exclusion and discrimination, which are usually sustained by socio-cultural and political legal institutions. The analytical framework of a rights-based approach goes beyond socio-economics to also encompass aspects of a society's social, cultural, legal and political dynamism. It aims to capture the root causes of the perpetuation of poverty, exclusion, discrimination and power relations that sustain inequity. So, with this multifaceted approach, a more complete analysis of a country's development situation, which potentially captures social and political processes, can be achieved. And the problem analysis takes departure in whose rights and what rights are now not being realized, and this crucially requires disaggregating data according to gender, citizenship, social status, ethnicity, etc., in order to indicate the extent to which different categories of people are affected or increasingly enjoying their human rights. Rights-based analysis also aims to determine what immediate underlying and structural obstacles there are to realizing rights, and they must necessarily identify responsible duty bearers. Now, there are certain features that distinguish, as we have just seen, distinguishes rights-based approach from other approaches. For example, we saw how needs-based approaches, there are in the literature basic needs approaches and various other development approaches, and we have seen how rights-based approach can be distinguished from the other approaches. But there are three basic features that distinguish rights-based approach from other approaches. One is a legal basis, second is a normative framework, and third is the process of realizing the overall goals. Let us look at these three features one after the other. Let us first look at the legal basis. Now, the legal basis, there are basically the international law specifies obligations that are legally binding under international law, and it talks about a two-pronged strategy that are for strengthening duty bearers to fulfill their obligations and empowering rights holders to claim their rights. Now, while an exclusive focus on either rights holders or duty bearers may be necessary and useful in the short term, a long-term one-sided strategy is unlikely to bring about the accountability dynamic that is at the core of this approach. If you look at this slide here, which is showing, you see that this needs to be read from the left to the right. We are basically looking at the rights-based efforts that goes to bring about changes. So, you have different actors here, duty bearers, you have rights holders, and then the changes in the structures and the changes in people's lives. And you see that there are support, the rights based efforts support rights holders in demanding their rights, which is the left side of the figure here, that the rights based efforts support rights holders in demanding their rights. So, rights holders basically demand their rights from the duty bearers. Let us say the duty bearers, the state as an actor, the state has an obligation to provide employment, as I was taking the example, and then there are duty bearers who have to fulfill their obligation towards the rights holders. So, rights based efforts also strengthen the accountability of duty bearers, and these bring in changes in structures through legal, civil, political, social and economic, and ultimately lead to a change in people's lives. However, there is a feedback to this system also because of the democratic process and because of various policy frameworks. In a dynamic world, there will always be a feedback from democratic processes and poverty reduction to continuous rights based efforts. And an internationally recognized normative framework sets specified levels of human rights. So, the point to understand here is that while there are rights holders and there are duty bearers, it works both ways. The efforts need to be in place which supports the rights holders in demanding their rights. For example, providing a policy framework of a right to education bill act, or a right to employment act, or a right to food act. These are all the rights based efforts that supports rights holders in demanding their rights. When you are entitled enough to demand your right for food or for employment or for health or for education, you will make a demand for it, demand which requires social accountability on the part of the state actors who are morally bound and duty bound to provide these rights to the rights holders. So, therefore, these rights based efforts in the form of providing entitlements through policy frameworks also strengthen accountability on the part of the duty bearers, which then go on to bring about changes in structures. So, the fact that we have already put in place Right to Education Act or Right to Employment Act means that we have brought about a basic change in the legal structure, the social structure, economic structure, and all of these changes within the structures brings about changes in people's lives by changing attitudes, empowering them, by ensuring that human rights have been realized, and this itself is a highly democratic process. It happens both ways, through rights based efforts and of course through a democratic process of providing feedback to the system. Now, the second aspect is that there are normative frameworks are set at certain specified levels of human rights. And now, international instruments and authoritative interpretations of human rights treaty bodies offer normative clarity and a roadmap for development to development practitioners. And there are 6 key principles that are derived from human rights instruments. These are as follows: one is universalism and inalienability, equality and non-discrimination, indivisibility and interdependence of human rights, participation and inclusion, accountability and rule of law. Now, let us look at some of the very basic features of each of these normative principles, the key principles. When we are talking about universalism and inalienability, what is it that we are pointing out? So, universalism basically means that every woman, man and child are entitled to enjoy their rights by virtue of being human. So, there are certain inalienable rights that cannot be taken away from someone or voluntarily given up. So, these are so this is one of the normative this is one of the key principles of the normative framework that guides rights based approaches. Secondly, equality and non-discrimination. Development efforts should focus on empowerment of excluded groups. When we talk about minorities or ethnic minority or ethnic groups of population belonging to the minorities, so we have to ensure that development efforts must focus on the empowerment of these excluded groups or the marginalized groups. Strengthen the state actors' capacity to realize the rights of these groups. Thirdly, indivisibility and interdependence of human rights. So, basically means that enjoyment of one right is indivisibly interrelated to the enjoyment of other rights. Now, we are enjoying one right does not mean that we give up the enjoyment of other rights. There is an interdependence of human rights. And the principle of non-retrogression, prioritization of some rights must not deliberately be at the expense of other rights. If I have a right, if I am exercising my right to food, does not mean that I give up my right to employment. So, there is an interdependence of these human rights, right to food and right to employment, and right to education and right to health all together might go on to increase the well-being of an individual or a family. Similarly, participation and inclusion, which is an entitlement guaranteed by international law, it must aim for free, active and meaningful participation of targeted communities. Accountability, to demand accountability means moving development from the realm of charity to that of obligations. When state actors, we have just seen, have an obligation to ensure that the rights of the rights holders are provided or protected or ensured are ensured progressively. So, that means that we are calling the state actors to accountability, or what is referred to as social accountability, public accountability and so on. Accountability also aims to strengthen a government's accountability to ensure good governance. Finally, rule of law. The disputes should be solved through adjudication by competent, impartial and independent processes, and access to the judicial machinery to invoke their rights to institute legal proceedings for appropriate redressal, grievance redressal. Now, finally, let us look at some of the process goals. The process of realizing human rights is central to a rights based approach. A person is a subject of his or her rights and an active participant in his or her development. So, human rights are thus by necessity active as well as practical. Active meaning that it is dependent on the participation of individuals and groups, and they are practical, meaning that they must be applicable in the daily lives of people. Therefore, rights should not only be promoted and protected by the duty bearers, but practiced and experienced by rights holders. So, the rights and freedoms which are of particular importance to ensure practicality and active enjoyment of human rights are the, for example, the right to information, freedom of expression, right to take part in the conduct of public affairs, right to participation in development processes, and so on. Finally, the approach regards the realization of human rights as both an outcome goal and a process goal. So, hopefully the idea of outcome goal and process goal has become clear to the students here. So, I have taken the example of employment and education and food. So, when we are talking about the outcome goal here, the fact that an individual is food secure, is able to access the required meals in a day because of having access to the required amount of income could be considered an outcome goal, whereas the process goal could be the individual's participation in the exercise of demanding the her right to food. So, that itself is a process goal. So, it is entitling. For example, when we are talking about ration cards, or when we are talking about NREGA cards, when we are talking about health cards or any kind of a card which is entitling us to demand the kind of basic necessity that we are entitled to, that entitlement which is provided in the form of a card is also a form of the process goal. So, it is empowering us to be a part of the process such that the outcome goal can be ensured. Okay, now let us look at some of the tools for operationalizing a rights based approach. So, now we have looked at what is rights based approach and what are the basic components of right based approach, the practices and concepts, and we have also seen how it is different from other approaches to development. And we have seen also that when we are talking about mainstreaming human rights in development processes or development approaches, what is it that we are trying to ensure? And often I think I said somewhere in the beginning of this lesson that organizations have made an attempt to ensure that they have had a human rights perspective to the development processes that they have carried out. However, the human rights approach in total, ensuring that all people's rights at all times have been ensured, may not have been implemented. However, there are attempts to ensure that human rights perspective have been mainstreamed in development processes. Now, let us look at some of the tools. So, there are various tools have come up over a period of time that have tried to operationalize rights based approach. For example, we have draft guidelines for a rights based approach to poverty reduction provided by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. We have UNDP and OHCHR that have developed a simple checklist for program staff. If a simple search on online search will give you this checklist. Human Rights Council of Australia has been a source of inspiration to NGOs developing a rights based approach. NORAD, which is the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, has developed a handbook on human rights assessment, which basically assists practitioners in asking the relevant questions concerning human rights, implementing and monitoring, and it includes a simple scoring tool for assessing how a program affects human rights, people's awareness and their rights. It looks something like this. The Human Rights Impact Analysis tool developed by NORAD 2001. So, it basically has a set of questions and there are certain legends for scoring. So, there are certain awareness questions and empowerment questions which addresses human rights issues, and these legends which are provided are represent a non-metric ordinal scale with increasing orders, but with no exact ranking. So, human rights enhancement often requires institutional reform or a change of attitudes, traditions or customs. Therefore, measuring human rights advancement often implies that economic, social, cultural and political processes are being reviewed. So, in some cases this may require follow up research, additional information gathering or targeted studies. If you look closely at the questions on this tool prepared by NORAD, you will see that these questions are actually trying to address some of the issues that I have just flagged off. With regard to awareness, what is the program's assumed actual impact on equality and on discrimination? So, you give a score which is showing in the legend as legends here. So, PI for positive impact, NC for no change, NI for negative impact, NA for no information available. And then you provide appropriate scores to this, and then follow up on each of these questions regarding if there has been a positive impact, you say that okay, there has been an impact here, but if there is no information available or negative impact, then we need to follow up that question on those counts and see why there has been no impact. Similarly, with regard to awareness questions, you have, has the population directly affected been informed about the program? So, let us again go back to the example of NREGS that I was taking. Suppose here we are talking about the implementation of the Right to Employment Guarantee Act in the Indian context, and we know that NREGS cards have been printed and they have been provided to various functionaries at the disaggregated level, let us say at the village level, and people need to be distributed these cards, or people have been informed to make a demand for employment. However, if people have not been informed about the process in the first place, then obviously there will be no demand for it. So the question to ask is, has the population directly been informed about the program? Does the program respect, or has it respected everyone's rights to seek and impart information relevant to its implementation? The same example of employment guarantee. Now, when we are talking about people demanding work in a certain program, have we ensured that everybody's right of seeking work? If you have read the NREGA Act very closely, you will see that it talks about everyone who is seeking employment should be given work within the 15 days of seeking employment, and if not, if they have not been provided work within the next 15 days, they would get some kind of an unemployment allowance. So, here the question is, does the program respect, or has it respected everyone's right to seek, or there are people who have not sought employment because they have not been informed about the program in the first place? If that is so, then we are not ensuring that human rights framework, although an act is in place, an entitlement policy has been in place, the system has not ensured that human rights approach has been mainstreamed appropriately in the development policy that we are trying to implement here. Some of the empowerment questions are as follows. Does the program respect, or has it respected the right to express views freely in the preparation and implementation? Let us say people's participation in deciding and designing the kind of works that need to come to a village, and therefore they can participate. So, if the functionaries in a village ensure that there is a development project that comes to a village, but there is heavy use of machinery, and people who are seeking work do not find sufficient numbers of employment in this development project, then obviously there is a conflict situation here, or there is a failure of the program in the first place. So, have the people been sufficiently empowered by taking part in the process of designing of work and ensuring that the work comes to the village in the first place? So, people's participation, people's planning. Does the program promote, or has the program promoted participation in decision making of groups affected? Does the program respect, or has it respected the right to just and favorable conditions of work? Does the program affect, or has it affected the fulfillment of right to an adequate standard of living for target groups and other people affected? So, for example, I have been talking about minimum wages as some kind of a process goal. So, this is question number 8 can be attributed to that process goal of ensuring minimum wages. Does the program affect, or has it affected the opportunity of people for self provision in terms of income generating activities? Does the program address the right to compensation for those negatively affected? So, these are some of the important questions that we can canvass in the form of a checklist for ensuring that when we are carrying out a study, let us say on the employment guarantee program or on the education guarantee program, we can make such checklists and see if these questions if these objectives have been ensured and fulfilled or not, and then we can analyze our data and say that okay, the human rights, we can very conclusively say that human rights framework has been integrated into this development exercise or has it not been. These are some of the components of a rights based project taken after the Human Rights Council of Australia. These are some of the points. Let me just read out some of the points. People involved in the project have a thorough knowledge of international human rights framework or not, whether initial negotiations with the agency of receiving government make it clear which rights is at issue, feasibility study involving communities in the designing of project, communities providing choices and giving undertakings regarding project, information provided including communities entitlement and decision making powers. If you look at number 8, guarantees given in case of project failures to ensure provision of services, and look at number 12, the responsibility for project evaluation and monitoring including participation of communities, and so on. Now, let us look at some of the challenges of implementing rights based approach. So, with regard to operationalization of rights based approach in development, you can basically form different kinds of checklists and see if those objectives that are enshrined in the human rights approach to development has been met or not. But what are the challenges of implementing a rights based approach to development? And there are many of these challenges. Let me begin by saying that there are considerable challenges to effectively implementing a rights based approach to development. And the first set of challenges relate to the inadequacy of state legal apparatuses, inconsistencies between the law and practice, and poor awareness of human rights among state actors and citizens. For example, although majority of states have ratified the human rights treaties, many states have not codified the treaties into domestic legal framework, which may contain laws that are contradictory to human rights. Secondly, even when there is a formal coherence between domestic law and international human rights, the policies and practices in a country may be applied in ways that are contrary to human rights principles. Further, many poor countries often suffer from underdeveloped legal and judicial systems that debilitate the rule of law. Citizens may be unaware of their rights, which makes it impossible for them to claim them. I may not be aware that I am entitled to an employment guarantee program, I am entitled to demand for work, and therefore the state actors can provide me work. I may not be aware of this. So, citizens may be unaware of their rights, and poor people often are deterred from approaching formal legal systems because of the costs engaged in hiring a lawyer, opportunity cost of time spent in court, and the general education and level of skills necessary to engage in litigation. For example, in the NREGS program itself, the provision that people should be provided unemployment allowances if work does not reach them within the specified 15 days, within a fortnight. Now, there is a certain procedure for ensuring that a person gets unemployment allowance. Usually, the opportunity cost of pursuing the officials for ensuring that unemployment allowance comes to their bank accounts is so high that people often are deterred to go after the officials to be able to do something like that. So, what needs to be done? So, these are the challenges. But there needs to be a system in place to address these challenges, and to address these challenges, a rights based development effort basically needs to undertake advocacy and be prepared to provide technical assistance to ensure that a state's formal laws comply with the human rights regime. Now, there are also a second set of challenges which relate to the cadre of development workers. The international development community usually has inadequate knowledge of human rights regime, and there is comparatively little experience of applying rights based approaches, and insufficient practical guidance is also available. So, the fact that majority of development practitioners have at best limited knowledge of human rights and associated instruments requires a systematic educational effort within the development community. So, a rights based approach to development needs to come up with practical guidelines which can be elaborated to the development practitioners at the community level. A third set of challenges is with regard to limitations of international human rights framework. For example, the international system for responding to violations of human rights is often accused of being ambiguous and sluggish and can be undermined by political agendas of the UN member states, and there is no independent international judiciary to assist in enforcing human rights in member states. In a nutshell, the human rights approaches have many shortcomings, but we must realize it is the best system that has been created so far. So, in light of the challenges, the centrality of human rights application to develop framework, we cannot neglect the mainstreaming human rights approaches to development framework anymore. We end this session with this concluding slide on human rights, freedom and poverty reduction, where we can say that rights based approach to development can be and a tool, and it is actually a broad concepts of poverty and poverty reduction. It makes of rights based approach linking it with poverty reduction strategies makes it more appealing in the sense that poverty then becomes a human rights issue and then compels the state actors to ensure that their obligations are. The rights based approach also provides the poor with an internationally recognized and meaningful participation in the development process. There is a considerable violent conflict, paradigm shift to reduce poverty, and poor people's deprived rights and freedoms. So, this is dynamic where we are talking about mainstreaming of human rights development approaches, and what we have covered in today's class is to give you a brief overview of what concepts and principles surrounding and how we can design a checklist based upon those concepts and principles to ensure a development project has mainstreamed human rights approach in its agenda or not. In the next class, we will look at some of the poverty measurements analysis, and we will follow a kind of a discussion where we see the operational issues surrounding poverty measures analysis within the large context of development research methods. So, I will see you in this class. Thank you.